What does it mean to hide? Not to conceal a secret, not to avoid an inconvenience, but to hide in the most literal, desperate sense. To remove yourself and everyone you love from the surface of the earth and descend into darkness voluntarily. Because what awaits above is worse than any claustrophobia, any deprivation, any cost of living in stone chambers beneath the ground. In the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, beneath hills of volcanic rock, weathered into strange formations by millennia of wind and rain, there exists a city that housed 20,000 people, not in houses, not in buildings constructed on the surface and later buried by time or disaster, but in chambers carved directly from living rock, descending 18 stories into the earth, 85 meters deep, connected by tunnels so narrow that a single person blocking the passage could halt an army. Derinkuyu, Turkish for deep well, a name as simple and functional as the city itself. No grand monuments, no decorative facades, just stone corridors, ventilation shafts calculated with precision, rolling stone doors that could seal entire sections, and the unmistakable evidence that thousands of human beings, families, children, livestock, lived here for extended periods, possibly years at a time, hidden from the world above. The city was rediscovered in 1963, when a local resident renovating his home knocked through a wall and discovered a room he had not known existed. Behind that room, another, and another, and tunnels leading down into darkness. What he had found was not a basement or a cellar, but an entrance to one of the largest and most sophisticated underground cities ever constructed by human hands. Since that accidental discovery, archaeologists have mapped 8 levels of Derinkuyu open to the public, but ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 18 levels total, possibly more, extending far deeper than tourists or researchers have yet explored. And Derinkuyu is not unique. The Cappadocia region contains over 200 underground cities, some connected to each other by tunnels extending for kilometers beneath the earth. Who built these cities? When? And most pressingly, why? What threat, what horror awaiting on the surface was terrible enough that entire populations chose to live in darkness, to raise children in stone chambers lit only by oil lamps, to breathe recycled air filtered through 85 meters of volcanic rock, rather than face whatever enemy prowled above? The conventional archaeological answer is invasion. Cappadocia sits at a crossroads of empires: Hittite, Phrygian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Mongol. For 3,000 years, armies have swept across these plains. Underground cities, the theory goes, served as temporary refuges where civilian populations could hide during raids, emerging when the danger passed. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Temporary refuge does not require 18 stories. It does not require sophisticated ventilation systems capable of supporting 20,000 people and their livestock for months. It does not require wine presses, oil presses, schools, churches carved in stone, and storage facilities sufficient to preserve food for extended habitation. Derinkuyu was not a panic room. It was a functioning city, designed for long-term survival, built with engineering precision that suggests its creators anticipated not a brief raid, but a sustained existential threat requiring total withdrawal from the surface world. What were they hiding from? And perhaps more disturbingly, could whatever drove them underground happen again? This is the complete documented history of Derinkuyu, the underground city that demonstrates, with uncomfortable clarity, that human civilization's relationship with the surface of the earth is more tenuous than we imagine. That entire populations can vanish beneath the ground, living in stone chambers for reasons we still do not fully understand, leaving behind only the question, what were they hiding from? Chapter 1: Discovery and the City Beneath. When the wall opened. In 1963, a resident of the town of Derinkuyu in Turkey's Cappadocia region was renovating his basement when his hammer broke through a wall and revealed a room that should not exist. The room was carved directly from the soft, volcanic tuff, compressed volcanic ash that forms the bedrock of the region. It was not a natural cave. The walls were too regular, the corners too precise. Someone had excavated this space deliberately, carving it from solid rock. And behind that room, another room, and a corridor leading down. What the homeowner had discovered was not a hidden cellar, but an entrance to an underground city that had been sealed and forgotten for centuries. Its tunnels and chambers lying silent beneath the modern town, directly under the feet of residents who had no idea it existed. Local authorities were notified. Archaeological teams from Turkish institutions arrived to investigate. And as they began to explore the tunnels extending beneath Derinkuyu, they realized the scale of what had been hidden. This was not a basement. This was not even a large complex of underground rooms. This was a city carved from living rock, extending down through multiple levels, capable of housing thousands of people. The initial archaeological survey mapped 8 levels, extending approximately 60 meters into the earth. These levels alone contained living quarters for an estimated 20,000 people, plus livestock. There were ventilation shafts, water wells, storage rooms, communal spaces, even wine presses and oil presses carved into the stone. But ground-penetrating radar, conducted in later decades, suggested the city extended far deeper. Current estimates place Derinkuyu at 18 stories underground, descending 85 meters below the surface, roughly the height of a modern 25-story building, inverted, carved downward into volcanic rock. Only the top 8 levels have been excavated and open to tourism. The lower 10 levels remain largely unexplored, either because they are flooded, collapsed, or deliberately sealed by the city's original inhabitants for reasons we may never know. The Derinkuyu we can explore today represents less than half of what exists beneath the earth. Modern visitors enter Derinkuyu through a controlled entrance with electric lighting and safety railings. The Turkish government has reinforced unstable sections, installed ventilation fans to supplement the ancient shafts, and marked clear pathways through the accessible levels to prevent tourists from becoming lost in the labyrinth of tunnels. But remove the modern infrastructure, the lights, the signs, the safety measures, and you are experiencing the city much as its original inhabitants did. Narrow tunnels requiring single-file passage, chambers carved with geometric precision, alcoves that served as sleeping quarters, and everywhere the sense of stone pressing close, of being surrounded by millions of tons of volcanic rock, of being deep beneath the earth with only carved channels allowing air to reach you from the distant surface. The architecture is functional, not decorative. No ornate carvings, no grand halls designed to inspire awe. Every element serves a purpose: survival, sustainability, defense. Because Derinkuyu was not built for comfort, it was built for hiding. And to understand why, we must first understand how. What engineering allowed 20,000 people to live beneath the earth without suffocating, starving, or descending into chaos? The single most critical feature of Derinkuyu is its ventilation system. Humans require continuous fresh air to survive, more when engaged in physical labor or enclosed in confined spaces with limited air circulation. 20,000 people, along with livestock, goats, sheep, chickens, possibly cattle, would require substantial air exchange to prevent carbon dioxide accumulation and oxygen depletion. Without continuous fresh air supply, an underground city housing that many people and animals would become unlivable within hours. Carbon dioxide would accumulate, oxygen would be depleted, everyone would asphyxiate. Derinkuyu's builders solved this problem with a system of vertical ventilation shafts connecting all 18 levels to the surface. Numerous shafts have been identified throughout the city, some extending the full 85 meters from the deepest levels to the open air above. These shafts are not simple holes drilled through rock. They are precisely engineered channels, carved with consistent width to optimize airflow without creating structural weakness in the surrounding rock. The shafts are positioned strategically throughout the city to ensure even air distribution. No chamber is more than a few meters from a ventilation shaft. Air circulation works through natural convection. Warm air from human and animal bodies rises through the shafts toward the surface. Cool air from above descends to replace it. The significant temperature differential between surface and deepest levels creates continuous gentle airflow without requiring any mechanical assistance. The system is elegant, passive, and remarkably effective. The ventilation system remains functional even today, with modern tourist traffic filling the accessible levels, despite the fact that it is over 2,000 years old and was designed for oil lamps and torches, not electric lights. Whoever designed Derinkuyu understood fluid dynamics and thermodynamics at a level that would not be formalized in scientific texts until the 17th century AD. The second critical system, water. Underground cities cannot rely on rain or surface water sources, which would be accessible to enemies during a siege. Derinkuyu's water comes from wells drilled deep into the aquifer beneath the city, extending deeper than the city itself. Multiple wells have been identified, penetrating well below the lowest excavated levels. These wells tap into underground water sources that are independent of surface conditions, ensuring water supply even during drought or when the surface is controlled by hostile forces. The wells are carved with precision, maintaining consistent diameter to prevent collapse while maximizing water access. Buckets on ropes could be lowered to retrieve water, which was then distributed throughout the city via a system of channels carved in the stone floors, allowing gravity to move water from higher to lower levels. Water collection chambers at various levels served as cisterns, storing water for use in cooking, sanitation, and livestock. Drainage channels prevented flooding, routing excess water deeper into the earth or into designated disposal areas. The water system, like the ventilation, required no mechanical pumps or external power. It functioned entirely through gravity and human labor, sustainable indefinitely as long as the aquifer remained active. With air and water secured, the city could sustain life. But sustaining life is not the same as sustaining society. Derinkuyu's builders did not create a mere survival bunker. They created a functioning community capable of maintaining social structure, education, religion, and commerce, even while hidden beneath the earth. The third level contains what archaeologists identify as living quarters, chambers ranging from small family alcoves to larger communal spaces. Sleeping niches are carved into the walls at approximately 1 meter above the floor, raised to avoid dampness and provide privacy. Storage alcoves hold amphorae for grain, oil, and wine. Cooking areas are positioned near ventilation shafts to allow smoke from oil lamps and small cooking fires to escape. The fourth level contains spaces identified as schools, rooms with stone benches carved along the walls, positioned to face a central area where a teacher might stand. The size and arrangement suggest communal education for children, indicating the city's inhabitants expected to remain underground long enough that education could not be neglected. The seventh level contains wine presses and oil presses, large stone basins where grapes and olives were crushed, their juice collected in carved channels that directed the liquid into storage vessels. These are not emergency provisions. These are industries, requiring sustained agricultural production, harvest, processing, and storage. Derinkuyu was not designed for hiding for days or weeks. It was designed for hiding for seasons, possibly years. Long enough that children needed schools. Long enough that wine needed to be produced and aged. Long enough that society needed to function, not merely survive. And perhaps most tellingly, the churches. Multiple chapels and religious spaces have been identified throughout Derinkuyu, recognizable by carved crosses and altar niches oriented toward the east, following Christian liturgical tradition. The crosses are Byzantine in style, suggesting these spaces were used by Christian communities during the Byzantine era, roughly 4th to 14th centuries AD. The presence of churches indicates that hiding was not a temporary emergency measure, but a sustained way of life requiring spiritual maintenance. Communities living underground for extended periods needed places of worship, needed religious ceremony, needed the psychological and social cohesion that ritual provides. And this raises uncomfortable questions. If Derinkuyu's inhabitants were Christian Byzantines hiding from persecution or invasion, why did they need such an elaborate, multi-generational city? Why not build fortifications on the surface? Why retreat entirely beneath the earth? The answer, as we will explore, may lie not with the people who used Derinkuyu during the Byzantine era, but with whoever built it, centuries or millennia earlier, for reasons we still struggle to understand. Because before we can understand why Derinkuyu exists, we must understand how it defends itself. The city's defensive architecture is ingenious and brutal. Throughout the tunnels, at strategic junctures, there are circular recesses carved into the walls. These recesses once held massive rolling stone doors, circular discs of volcanic rock, approximately 1.5 meters in diameter and up to half a meter thick, weighing several hundred kilograms each. These doors could be rolled into place to seal off entire sections of the city from the inside. Once positioned, the doors completely blocked passage. Too heavy to move from the outside without machinery, too thick to break through with hand tools. A small hole in the center of each door allowed defenders to observe or attack anyone attempting to force entry, while remaining protected behind stone too thick for arrows or spears to penetrate. The doors are asymmetrical, designed to roll smoothly from inside the defended section, but to wedge tightly when pressure is applied from the outside, making them effectively impossible to force open by brute strength alone. Multiple doors could seal different levels independently. If invaders somehow breached the upper levels, defenders could retreat to lower levels and seal those sections separately, creating a layered defense where each level served as a fallback position. This is not refugee architecture. This is fortress architecture, military architecture. The architecture of a people expecting not raids, but sieges. Not brief hiding, but sustained resistance. The archaeologists who first explored Derinkuyu in the 1960s emerged from the tunnels with more questions than they had carried in. This was not a simple hiding place. This was not a temporary shelter dug in panic during a single crisis. This was a city designed with sophistication, matching or exceeding surface cities of the same era. A city that required decades, possibly centuries, of construction. A city that represented an investment of labor and planning so immense that it could only be justified by one conclusion. Whoever built Derinkuyu believed that the surface world would become uninhabitable, not briefly, not temporarily, but for extended periods, requiring total withdrawal, complete self-sufficiency, and the capacity to defend against enemies who would kill them if discovered. And the most unsettling realization: we still do not know who those builders were. Chapter 2. Who built Derinkuyu and when? The architects in darkness. Determining who built Derinkuyu is complicated by the fact that the city has no writing, no inscriptions, no dedicatory plaques identifying its founders. Unlike surface monuments, where rulers carve their names and accomplishments in stone for posterity, Derinkuyu is anonymous, functional. Its builders left no record of who they were, when they lived, or why they carved an entire city beneath the earth. What we have is circumstantial evidence, stratified occupation layers, and competing theories from archaeologists who examine the same stone chambers and reach different conclusions. The conventional academic consensus attributes Derinkuyu to the Phrygians, an Indo-European people who dominated central Anatolia during the Iron Age, roughly 1200 to 700 BC. Phrygian settlements are well documented in the Cappadocia region. The volcanic tuff that forms the bedrock is soft enough to carve with bronze or iron tools, but hardens when exposed to air, making it ideal for underground construction. Archaeological surveys have identified tool marks in Derinkuyu's walls consistent with Iron Age implements, chisels, picks, and scrapers, rather than the more advanced drilling techniques used in later periods. Some chambers contain pottery fragments and domestic items datable to the Phrygian period through stylistic analysis and carbon dating of organic residues. The Phrygian attribution is supported by the fact that similar underground structures exist throughout Phrygia's historical territory, suggesting a cultural tradition of subterranean architecture that Derinkuyu represents in its most extreme and sophisticated form. But there are problems with this theory. First problem: Derinkuyu may be much older than the Phrygians. The Hittite Empire, which preceded the Phrygians in Anatolia, collapsed around 1200 BC during the Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic period when multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously fell. Some researchers suggest that knowledge of underground construction techniques existed in this region during the Hittite period, and that the Phrygians may have expanded structures originally initiated by earlier cultures. The deepest levels of Derinkuyu may date to the Hittite period or beyond, with successive cultures adding upper levels and modifications over centuries. Carbon dating is difficult because the city is carved from inorganic rock. Stone does not contain carbon and cannot be radiocarbon dated. What can be dated are organic materials found in the city: charcoal from fires, wooden structural elements, food residues, and organic inclusions in mortar. But these materials date the use of the city, not its original construction. A charcoal sample carbon dated to 800 BC tells us that someone lit a fire in that location around 800 BC. It does not tell us when the chamber containing that charcoal was originally carved. The deepest, most inaccessible levels of Derinkuyu remain unexplored and undated. They may hold evidence of construction methods or occupation periods far older than current theories acknowledge. Second problem: Derinkuyu is not unique. Over 200 underground cities have been identified in the Cappadocia region. Some are small, a few rooms and passages. Others rival Derinkuyu in scale. Kaymakli, located just a few kilometers from Derinkuyu, extends 8 levels deep and housed an estimated 5,000 people. Oskonak, Mazi, and dozens of smaller sites form a network of interconnected subterranean settlements. Some of these cities are connected by tunnels extending for kilometers beneath the earth, passages wide enough for a single person to walk through, allowing movement between cities without ever surfacing. Derinkuyu has tunnel connections to Kaymakli and possibly to other cities further afield. This is not the work of a single community building a single refuge. This is regional infrastructure, a system, a network designed to allow thousands or tens of thousands of people to disappear beneath the earth and continue functioning as a civilization. Building such a network would require decades, possibly centuries, of sustained labor, coordination between multiple communities, shared architectural knowledge passed down through generations, and a unified understanding of threat that motivated such an extraordinary investment. The Phrygians may have expanded Derinkuyu and used it extensively, but did they initiate the network? Or were they inheriting and adapting an infrastructure built by predecessor cultures, responding to threats we no longer remember? What we know with certainty is that Derinkuyu was used extensively during the Byzantine period, roughly 400 to 1400 AD. The carved crosses in the underground churches are distinctly Byzantine. Fresco fragments found in some chambers show Christian iconography consistent with Byzantine religious art, and historical texts from the Byzantine era make explicit references to Christians in Cappadocia hiding in underground cities during periods of Arab-Byzantine warfare. During the 7th through 10th centuries AD, Cappadocia was a frontier region contested between the Byzantine Empire and the expanding Islamic caliphates. Arab raids were frequent, devastating, and targeted Christian populations specifically. Byzantine Christians in exposed rural areas had limited options: flee to fortified cities, which might be days away, submit to conquest, or hide. Derinkuyu offered a third option: disappear. Historical accounts describe Byzantine civilians retreating to underground cities when Arab raiding parties approached. They would descend with livestock and supplies, seal the entrances, and wait, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. The raiders would loot surface towns, take what slaves they could find, and move on, never suspecting that thousands of people were hiding beneath their feet. The Christians did not build Derinkuyu, but they perfected its use as a defensive refuge, adding churches, improving ventilation, expanding storage capacity to support longer underground habitation. And they left written records describing why they hid: to survive religious persecution and military conquest. But this raises the question that haunts every scholar who studies Derinkuyu. If Byzantine Christians were hiding from Arab raids, a threat that lasted decades, not centuries, why did they need a city capable of sustaining 20,000 people indefinitely? Why did earlier cultures invest so much labor in creating this infrastructure? What were the Phrygians hiding from? What were the Hittites hiding from? The standard historical explanation is invasion. Anatolia, the heartland of modern Turkey where Cappadocia is located, has been invaded repeatedly across 3 millennia. The Assyrian Empire raided Phrygia in the 8th century BC. The Cimmerians, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppe, destroyed the Phrygian capital Gordion around 700 BC. The Persian Empire conquered the region in the 6th century BC. Alexander the Great's armies swept through in the 4th century BC. Roman legions, Parthian cavalry, Gothic raiders, Sasanian Persians, Arab caliphates, Mongol hordes, wave after wave of conquest. Each invasion brought massacre, enslavement, and destruction of surface settlements. Underground cities offered protection, not absolute, a determined besieging force could eventually starve defenders out, but sufficient to survive raids and brief occupations. The invasion theory is plausible. It explains why defensive architecture dominates Derinkuyu's design. It explains why the city is so large, 20,000 refugees from surrounding towns and villages during a major invasion. It explains the longevity. New invaders meant new hiding, generation after generation. But it struggles to explain why underground cities are so numerous and so interconnected. It struggles to explain why they are all concentrated in Cappadocia rather than distributed across Anatolia wherever invasions occurred. And it struggles to explain why surface defenses, walls, fortresses, watchtowers, were not preferred over the immense labor of carving cities beneath the earth. Building defensive walls requires less labor than excavating 18 stories underground. Yet Derinkuyu exists. Why? Some researchers propose a different explanation: climate catastrophe. The period around 1200 BC, when Derinkuyu may have been initially constructed, corresponds to a documented global climate event. Ice core samples from Greenland show abrupt temperature drops. Archaeological sites across the eastern Mediterranean show evidence of drought, famine, and population collapse. The Bronze Age civilizations, Hittite, Mycenaean, Egyptian New Kingdom, suffered simultaneous crises. Theories vary regarding the cause. Volcanic eruptions throwing ash into the atmosphere and causing cooling. Shifts in ocean currents altering precipitation patterns. Solar minimums reducing agricultural productivity. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastation. Crops failed, populations starved, governments collapsed, and survivors adapted. Perhaps underground cities were one adaptation. Volcanic tuff maintains a constant temperature, cooler in summer, warmer in winter, providing protection against surface temperature extremes. Underground water sources remain accessible even during droughts when surface rivers fail. Storage capacity allows preservation of grain harvests against multi-year famines. Climate catastrophe would explain the regional concentration in Cappadocia, a specific area with ideal geology for underground construction and a population desperate enough to attempt it. It would explain the scale. Entire communities relocating underground, not just during crises, but as a permanent adaptation. It would explain the longevity, recurring droughts and climate instability, making surface agriculture unreliable for centuries. But like the invasion theory, the climate theory is circumstantial. We have no written records from Derinkuyu's builders explaining their motivations. We have only the city itself, carved in silent stone, its purpose lost to time. What we can say with confidence is this: Derinkuyu was likely initiated during the Hittite or early Phrygian period, roughly 1200 to 800 BC. It was expanded and modified over subsequent centuries by successive cultures. Phrygians, Persians, Hellenistic Greeks, Romans, Byzantines. Each generation adapted the city to their needs, adding levels, improving systems, carving new chambers. The city was used most heavily during periods of crisis: the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, the Sumerian invasions, the Arab-Byzantine wars, possibly the Mongol conquests. During peaceful periods, the cities may have been abandoned or used only for storage. The final major occupation was Byzantine Christian, ending sometime between the 10th and 14th centuries AD, when the region stabilized under Byzantine and later Ottoman control, and the need for underground refuge diminished. By the time the city was rediscovered in 1963, it had been sealed and forgotten for centuries. The knowledge of who built it, when, and exactly why had been lost. We have the city, We have evidence of use. We have geological and archaeological data allowing rough dating. But we do not have the builder's own account of why they chose to carve an entire civilization beneath the earth. And that absence haunts every stone corridor. Chapter 3. Life beneath the earth. How 20,000 people lived in darkness. Imagine descending into the earth with your family, your neighbors, everyone you know. Imagine sealing the stone door behind you, cutting yourself off from sunlight, from open air, from the surface world. Imagine knowing that you might remain underground for weeks, months, possibly longer, that children might be born in these chambers, that elderly might die here, that life must continue in darkness because the alternative is worse. This was not hypothetical for Derinkuyu's inhabitants. This was survival, and survival required more than air and water. It required society. It required maintaining the structures that make humans civilized rather than merely alive. Education, religion, commerce, law, family bonds, community cohesion. All of it functioning in stone chambers lit only by oil lamps, where the ceiling presses close and the walls never end. How did they do it? Daily life in Derinkuyu followed rhythms dictated not by sunrise and sunset, but by the practical necessities of underground existence. Food preparation dominated much of each day. Archaeological evidence shows cooking areas positioned near ventilation shafts to allow smoke from fires and oil lamps to escape. Clay ovens were built into alcoves carved for that purpose, their chimneys connecting to the nearest ventilation channel. Bread was the staple, wheat and barley flour ground on stone querns, mixed with water from the wells, baked in the clay ovens. Archaeological excavations have recovered grain stores containing wheat, barley and lentils, preserved by the constant cool temperature underground. Storage chambers on the lower levels could hold enough grain to sustain the population for months, possibly over a year if rationed carefully. Olive oil, wine, and dried fruits supplemented the diet. The wine presses and oil presses on the 7th level were not merely symbolic, they were functional industrial facilities. Grapes and olives grown on the surface during peaceful periods were brought underground, processed, and stored. Wine fermentation actually benefits from the constant cool temperature and darkness of underground storage, producing a more stable product than surface cellars. Livestock provided meat, milk, and eggs. Stables have been identified on multiple levels, with manure disposal channels directing waste to designated areas where it could be removed or composted. Chickens, goats, and sheep could survive underground as long as they had food and water. Cattle were possible, but more difficult. Their size and feed requirements made them impractical for extended underground habitation. The air would have been thick with cooking smoke, animal odors, human body heat, and the smell of oil lamps burning continuously. Sanitation required constant attention. Waste disposal channels were carved to direct sewage away from living areas, down to lower levels or into designated pits that could be sealed when full. Despite the ventilation system's sophistication, the air quality would have been poor by modern standards. Respiratory infections were likely common. Children and elderly would have suffered most. But the alternative was death on the surface. So life continued below. Education could not stop simply because the community was hiding. The chambers identified as schools contained stone benches carved along walls, positioned to face a central area where a teacher would stand. The arrangement is similar to surface schools of the Byzantine period, communal spaces where children of various ages learned together. What was taught? We can only infer from the culture that used the city during documented periods. Byzantine Christian communities would have prioritized religious education, psalms, prayers, biblical stories, liturgical practices. Literacy would have been limited to clergy and wealthy families, but oral tradition was strong. Children learned through memorization and repetition. Practical skills were essential. Boys learned their father's trades: carpentry, metalworking, agriculture, animal husbandry. Girls learned weaving, cooking, household management, textile production. Not through formal schooling, but through apprenticeship and family transmission. Mathematics and accounting were necessary for a functioning community. Grain stores needed tracking. Rationing required calculation. Trade and barter required numeracy. Someone had to manage the logistics of keeping 20,000 people fed, supplied, and organized. Music and storytelling likely played significant roles. In an environment without natural light variation to mark time, without visual stimulation beyond stone walls, oral culture would have provided entertainment, preserved history, and maintained morale. Imagine children growing up knowing only these stone chambers, never seeing stars, never feeling rain, never running across open ground. For them, the underground city was not a refuge, it was the world. The surface was a story told by adults, a dangerous place where enemies lived, a realm of myth they could not quite imagine. When the doors finally opened and they emerged into sunlight for the first time, what must that have felt like? Religion provided psychological survival. The underground churches of Derinkuyu are not large or ornate. They are functional spaces carved with the same pragmatic efficiency as the rest of the city. But they are unmistakably sacred. Crosses carved into walls and ceilings, altars carved from living rock, niches for icons and relics, orientation toward the east following liturgical tradition. Byzantine Christianity emphasized liturgy, ritual, and community worship. Even underground, cut off from bishops and monasteries, congregations maintained their practices. Priests conducted services by oil lamp light. The faithful gathered for morning and evening prayers. Saints' days and holy festivals were observed even when the calendar above ground had lost meaning. Religion explained suffering. It provided purpose. God was testing the faithful through tribulation. Hiding was not cowardice, but prudent preservation of the Christian community against pagan invaders. Endurance underground was martyrdom without death, suffering that demonstrated faith. For a population living in stone chambers, breathing smoke-thick air, rationing food, caring for sick children in darkness, religion offered the only framework that made such existence tolerable. This was not mere survival. This was spiritual trial. This was faith made manifest. The churches were the only spaces in Derinkuyu that served no practical survival function. They produced no food. They stored no supplies. They contributed nothing to defense or sanitation or air circulation. They existed purely for the soul. And that the builders chose to carve churches at all, that they allocated scarce space and labor to sacred spaces when every chamber could have been storage or housing, tells us something profound about human psychology. We do not live by bread alone, even when bread is scarce. We need meaning. We need ritual. We need connection to something beyond mere survival. The churches of Derinkuyu are evidence that hope can exist even in darkness. Industry had to continue. Tool maintenance was critical. Bronze and iron tools used for excavation, agriculture, cooking, and defense wore down constantly. A blacksmith's forge has been identified on one of the middle levels, a carefully ventilated chamber where metal could be heated, worked, and repaired. The forge would have been one of the hottest, most uncomfortable spaces in the entire city, surrounded by stone that trapped heat, with smoke venting through shafts that could not fully dissipate the oppressive temperature. But without the forge, tools failed. Without tools, expansion and maintenance stopped. The city died. Textile production continued underground. Weaving looms required space and light. Women would have worked near oil lamps, producing cloth for clothing and blankets, wool from sheep, linen from stored flax. Every garment worn by 20,000 people had to be produced, maintained, and eventually replaced. Pottery production for storage vessels, cooking pots, and oil lamps. Leather working for shoes, bags, and harnesses. Carpentry for doors, supports, and furniture. All the industries that sustain a surface town had to function underground, in confined spaces, with limited light, using materials that had to be brought down from the surface or salvaged from what existed below. The economy was necessarily simple: barter, direct exchange, communal resource management. But it was an economy. People specialized. Craftsmen traded their products for food and other necessities. Farmers who managed the underground gardens traded produce for metalwork and textiles. Money likely held less value underground than skill. A goldsmith's gold meant nothing if there was no bread. But a baker's bread meant survival. The hierarchy of value inverted. What mattered was not wealth, but competence, not status, but contribution. Children adapted because children always adapt. For adults, living underground was a sacrifice, an emergency measure, a temporary hardship to be endured until safety returned. For children born in these chambers, the underground city was simply home. They played in the tunnels, inventing games that fit the space. Hide and seek in the labyrinth of passages. Racing through corridors too narrow for adults. Climbing the stone benches in the schools. Listening to echoes. Learning which shafts carried sound and which absorbed it. They learned the geography of the city the way surface children learn the streets of their town. They knew which levels were safe for exploration and which were forbidden. They knew where the cold air from the ventilation shafts felt strongest, where the wells dropped deepest, where the echoes sounded strangest. They did not know they were deprived. They did not understand that life on the surface offered things they lacked. Open sky, sunlight, unrestricted movement, the smell of rain, the sight of trees, the feeling of wind. Until the doors opened, until they emerged and saw the world above for the first time. And then the realization: everything they had known was a shadow. Everything they had lived was confinement. The real world was vast and bright and terrifying. Some children, having spent years underground, reportedly refused to leave when the danger passed. The surface was too open, too exposed, too bright. The chambers were home. The darkness was safety. Imagine the psychological adaptation required for that inversion. Imagine light becoming threat. Imagine open space becoming panic. That is what Derinkuyu did to the human psyche. It turned natural human preferences inside out. It made darkness safe and light dangerous. It made confinement protective and freedom lethal. And it worked. The population survived. Civilizations that hid in Derinkuyu outlasted civilizations that fought on the surface. But at what psychological cost? Death underground presented unique challenges. Bodies decompose. In enclosed spaces with limited ventilation, a corpse becomes a biohazard within days. 20,000 people living in close quarters could not tolerate burials inside the city. Some chambers have been tentatively identified as temporary morgues, cool spaces where bodies could be preserved briefly before burial. But final interment had to occur elsewhere. During short hiding periods, bodies were carried to the surface once danger passed and given proper burial in surface cemeteries. Christian tradition required burial in consecrated ground, ideally in proximity to churches. Derinkuyu's inhabitants would have made every effort to observe these practices. But during extended occupation, when the surface remained hostile for months or longer, compromises were necessary. Bodies might be placed in sealed chambers within the deepest levels, away from living areas, to await later proper burial. Or in extreme cases, remains might be committed to the deepest wells, consigned to the earth in a manner far from ideal, but necessary for the survival of the living. The psychological weight of this cannot be understated. Watching a loved one die and being unable to provide traditional funeral rites. Knowing their body rested in darkness, awaiting a burial that might never come if the community could never safely return to the surface. Death is difficult in any circumstance. Death underground, in confined quarters, with no access to proper burial, must have been almost unbearable. Yet people endured, because the alternative was the entire community dying on the surface, slaughtered by invaders or starved by drought. Better to grieve in darkness and survive than to die in sunlight with proper ceremony. Derinkuyu demanded sacrifices of the living and the dead alike. And still, it was worth the cost, because surviving underground was only half the challenge. The other half was defending against those who would kill everyone hiding below if they discovered the entrance. Chapter 4: Abandonment and Rediscovery. When the doors opened forever. We do not know exactly when Derinkuyu was finally abandoned. The archaeological evidence suggests the city was in active use through at least the 10th or 11th century AD, during the later Byzantine period. Byzantine Christian artifacts, pottery, tools, religious items, datable to this period, have been recovered from various levels. But sometime between the 11th and 14th centuries, the use of Derinkuyu as a permanent or semi-permanent refuge appears to have ceased. The population stopped retreating underground during crises. The chambers were left empty. The doors were no longer maintained. Why? The most likely explanation is stabilization. By the 11th century, the Arab-Byzantine wars that had ravaged Cappadocia for centuries were winding down. The Byzantine Empire had regained control of the region. Borders stabilized. The frequency of raids diminished. The threat that had driven populations underground for generations finally receded. Additionally, the Seljuk Turks conquered Cappadocia in the 11th century, establishing more stable governance than the chaotic frontier warfare of previous centuries. Under Seljuk and later Ottoman rule, Cappadocia became an interior province rather than a contested border region. Raids became rare. Populations could settle on the surface with reasonable expectation of safety. Underground cities designed for hiding during invasions became unnecessary. The skills required to maintain them, managing ventilation, defending choke points, rationing supplies for extended underground habitation, were no longer passed to younger generations. Knowledge eroded. The entrances were sealed, possibly deliberately to prevent accidents or unauthorized use. Chambers collapsed, tunnels flooded, ventilation shafts filled with debris. Nature reclaimed what humans had abandoned, and within a few generations, the locations of the cities were forgotten. Oral traditions mentioning tunnels beneath the earth, or chambers where ancestors hid became vague folklore. Stories told to children, but not taken seriously by adults who lived in stable surface towns and had never needed to hide. Derinkuyu passed from living memory into myth. For approximately 600 years, Derinkuyu lay forgotten beneath the town that bore its name. Residents lived, worked, raised families, built houses, dug wells, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay 18 stories of carved chambers extending 85 meters into the earth. In 1963, a resident was renovating his basement, a common enough project in a town where many homes had cellars carved into the soft volcanic rock for storage. He was using a hammer to expand his basement when the wall gave way, revealing not more rock, but a void. A room, carved walls, a corridor leading into darkness. He fetched a lamp and explored cautiously. The room connected to other rooms. Tunnels descended deeper, and the realization dawned. This was not a natural cave or a simple cellar. This was something far larger. He reported his discovery to local authorities. Initial investigations confirmed the extraordinary nature of the find. Turkish archaeologists arrived to conduct systematic exploration. What they found exceeded all expectations. The initial survey team descended through the accessible levels, mapping as they went. They identified living quarters, storage chambers, churches, wells, wine presses, schools. They found stone doors still in position, ventilation shafts extending to the surface, defensive architecture intact, and they found evidence of sophistication that challenged assumptions about ancient engineering. The ventilation system's precision suggested advanced understanding of airflow and thermodynamics. The water management system demonstrated knowledge of hydrology and aquifer dynamics. The defensive architecture reflected military engineering that rivaled surface fortifications. This was not primitive refuge digging. This was urban planning on a grand scale, executed with technical competence that would be impressive in a surface city and was extraordinary for an underground structure. Carbon dating of organic materials, stylistic analysis of pottery and tools, and examination of Byzantine Christian symbols allowed rough dating of various occupation phases. The consensus emerged that the city was likely initiated during the Hittite or Phrygian period, 1200 to 700 BC, and used extensively through the Byzantine era, 400 to 1100 AD, a span of nearly 2,000 years. Further exploration revealed that Derinkuyu was not unique. Survey teams discovered tunnel connections to other underground cities in the region. Kaymakli, just 5 kilometers away, had similar architecture and scale. Ozkonak, Marzi, and dozens of smaller sites formed a network. The archaeological community realized this was not one city, but a system. A regional infrastructure for underground habitation, built and maintained across centuries, representing one of the most ambitious construction projects in ancient Anatolia. And modern residents had been living above it, completely unaware, for 600 years. By the late 1960s, the Turkish government had recognized Derinkuyu's significance as both a historical site and a potential tourist attraction. The upper 8 levels were reinforced, stabilized, and fitted with electric lighting, ventilation fans to supplement the ancient shafts, and safety measures to prevent accidents. A controlled entrance was constructed. Informational plaques were installed, explaining the history and function of various chambers. Derinkuyu opened to tourism by the early 1970s. Since then, hundreds of thousands of visitors have descended into the ancient city. They walk through tunnels where Byzantine Christians once hid from Arab raiders. They see wine presses that produced wine 2,000 years ago. They peer down ventilation shafts extending 85 meters into darkness. They marvel at the stone doors and imagine them sealing, cutting off the outside world, protecting 20,000 people hiding below. But tourism necessarily changes what is experienced. Electric lights eliminate the darkness that once defined the city. Safety rails prevent access to dangerous areas that ancient residents navigated daily. Tourists descend knowing they will return to the surface in an hour or two, experiencing Derinkuyu as a curiosity rather than a necessity. The visceral reality of living underground for months, breathing smoke-thick air, rationing food, defending against enemies attempting to breach the stone doors, that cannot be recreated for visitors. It can only be imagined. And yet, even sanitized for tourism, Derinkuyu retains power. The scale alone is overwhelming. The engineering precision is humbling. The realization that entire civilizations chose to live in these chambers rather than face threats on the surface forces contemplation of what those threats must have been. Tourism revenue has funded ongoing archaeological research. Modern ground-penetrating radar and sonar surveys have revealed the full extent of the city, 18 stories, 85 meters deep, possibly extending even further in sections that are collapsed or flooded. Magnetic surveys suggest the presence of metallic objects in sealed chambers, possibly weapons, tools, or religious artifacts. But only 8 levels are open to the public. Levels 9 through 18 remain largely unexplored. Why? Partly logistics. The lower levels are more dangerous, higher risk of collapse, flooding, poor air quality. Excavation would require significant investment in safety infrastructure. Partly preservation. Once chambers are opened and exposed to air circulation, deterioration accelerates. Frescoes fade. Stone crumbles. Archaeologists must balance the desire for discovery with the responsibility to preserve what exists. And partly mystery. There is value, both scientific and imaginative, in knowing that something remains unknown. That beneath the 8 levels tourists walk through, 10 more levels wait in darkness, holding secrets we have not yet uncovered. What is down there? Are there chambers sealed deliberately by the original inhabitants, containing artifacts they chose to hide? Are there bodies in the deepest wells, the remains of those who died during sieges and could not be given proper burial? Are there inscriptions or carvings that would answer the fundamental question, who built Derinkuyu and why? We do not know, and perhaps we never will, because every act of exploration is also an act of disturbance. Every sealed chamber opened is a chamber that can never again be pristine. So the lower levels wait, patient, silent, holding their secrets beneath 85 meters of stone and earth. Derinkuyu is the most famous of Cappadocia's underground cities, but it is far from the only one. Over 200 underground sites have been identified in the region. Most are small, a few chambers, minimal infrastructure, but dozens rival Derinkuyu in scale and sophistication. Kaimakli, the second largest, is open to tourism and receives nearly as many visitors as Derinkuyu. Ozkonak features unique defensive elements, including vertical holes designed for pouring boiling oil on attackers. Maize has elaborate ventilation systems and water management. Some cities remain entirely unexplored, known only through local folklore and preliminary surveys. Tunnel connections between cities suggest a network. During crises, populations could move underground from city to city, remaining hidden for extended periods while enemies controlled the surface. The tunnels are too narrow for armies, but sufficient for civilian refugees moving in small groups. Imagine an entire civilization existing beneath the earth. Tens of thousands of people occupying interconnected underground chambers, farming the surface during peaceful periods, but retreating below when threatened. A parallel society, invisible to conquerors, sustaining itself until danger passed. That is what Cappadocia's underground cities represent. Not isolated refuges, but infrastructure for an alternative way of living. A civilization that could disappear and re-emerge at will, adapting to surface threats by simply removing itself from the surface. And all of it forgotten for 600 years. Sealed, abandoned, erased from memory, rediscovered by accident, by a man with a hammer who knocked through a wall and found eternity waiting on the other side. What does Derinkuyu teach us? On the surface, and the metaphor is deliberate, it teaches us about ancient engineering, about defensive architecture, about human adaptability under extreme conditions. These are valuable lessons, documented and preserved in academic papers and archaeological reports. But the deeper lesson, the one that haunts everyone who descends into those stone chambers, is more unsettling. Derinkuyu teaches us that the surface world is not permanent, that civilization's relationship with the earth beneath our feet is more precarious than we admit, that there have been times in human history when the only rational response to threats was to disappear entirely, to abandon the surface and retreat into darkness. And it could happen again. The specific threats that drove Derinkuyu's construction, invasions, religious persecution, possibly climate catastrophe, are not ancient history. They are recurring patterns. Modern nation-states build underground bunkers for government continuity during nuclear war. Wealthy individuals construct survival shelters against societal collapse. Research stations in Antarctica and deep mines create artificial environments where humans can survive independently of surface conditions. These are Derinkuyu's descendants. The technology is more sophisticated. The motivations are documented in planning memos rather than lost to history. But the fundamental logic is identical. Prepare for the possibility that the surface becomes uninhabitable. We like to believe we have progressed beyond the need for such measures. We have militaries, international law, climate science, global cooperation. Surely we can manage threats without hiding underground. But Derinkuyu's builders likely believed the same. They had empires, armies, trade networks, religious institutions. They were not primitives cowering from superstition. They were organized civilizations with advanced engineering and social structures. And still, they built cities beneath the earth. Still, they planned for total withdrawal. Still, they accepted that civilization on the surface could fail so completely that survival required descending into stone chambers and sealing the doors. What did they know that we prefer to forget? Knowledge fragility is Derinkuyu's second lesson. The city was used for nearly 2,000 years, maintained across centuries. Its ventilation systems, water management, defensive features represented accumulated engineering knowledge refined through generations. And within 600 years of abandonment, all of it was forgotten. The location lost. The architectural principles erased from cultural memory. The knowledge of how to sustain 20,000 people underground vanished so completely that when Derinkuyu was rediscovered, modern archaeologists needed weeks to understand systems that ancient residents managed routinely. This pattern repeats throughout human history. Roman concrete formulas lost for 1,500 years. Greek fire's composition forgotten. Damascus steel techniques unrecoverable. entire bodies of practical knowledge that took centuries to develop, gone in a single generation when transmission breaks. We assume progress is linear. We assume knowledge accumulates irreversibly. But Derinkuyu demonstrates the opposite. Knowledge requires active maintenance. Skills must be practiced. Traditions must be transmitted. The moment a generation stops teaching its children, stops documenting its methods, stops maintaining its infrastructure, knowledge dies. And once lost, it may never be recovered. We can study Derinkuyu's architecture. We can measure its ventilation shafts and analyze its engineering, but we cannot ask its builders why they made certain choices, what threats they feared most, what experiences drove them to excavate 18 stories into darkness. That knowledge died with them, and no amount of modern research can resurrect it. There is something profoundly melancholic about Derinkuyu. It represents extraordinary human achievement, the engineering, the social organization, the sheer will required to carve a city beneath the earth and sustain it for millennia. But it also represents extraordinary human suffering. No one builds Derinkuyu because life is good. No one retreats underground for years because the surface is safe and prosperous. Every chamber, every tunnel, every stone door is evidence of desperation, of populations so threatened that they chose confinement over extinction. The wine presses represent not celebration, but the need to maintain morale during extended darkness. The schools represent not education for its own sake, but the grim necessity of teaching children survival skills because the next generation would need them too. The churches represent not faith triumphant, but faith tested, communities praying for deliverance while hiding in stone chambers beneath the earth. Derinkuyu is beautiful in its engineering, admirable in its functionality, and tragic in its existence, because a world that requires Derinkuyu is a world that has failed its people, a world where the only safety is hiding, a world where civilization survives only by removing itself from civilization's stage. And yet, life continues. The modern town of Derinkuyu thrives. Tourism brings revenue. Children attend schools on the surface, unaware that their ancestors attended schools carved in stone beneath their feet. Markets sell goods above ground where wine presses once operated below. The surface has reclaimed what the depths protected, and perhaps that is Derinkuyu's final lesson. Survival is enough. The people who hid underground did not defeat their enemies in glorious battle. They did not overthrow oppressive regimes. They did not transform the conditions that threatened them. They simply survived. They endured. They maintained their communities and their cultures through dark times, emerging when conditions allowed, passing their heritage to descendants who eventually lived in sunlight again. That is not epic victory. It is not the stuff of legends and heroic songs. But it is, perhaps, the most fundamental human achievement, enduring long enough to see the next day, protecting children long enough for them to have children, preserving knowledge and tradition through catastrophe so that when the crisis ends, something remains to rebuild upon. Derinkuyu's builders did not save the world. They saved their world, their families, their communities, their way of life, preserved in darkness until it could safely exist in light again. And because they succeeded, because they survived, we exist. We inherit a world shaped by those who endured when endurance seemed impossible, who hid when hiding was the only option, who descended into the earth and waited, patient and silent, until it was safe to return. Derinkuyu exists. 85 meters beneath the surface of Cappadocia, 18 stories of carved chambers hold the memory of 20,000 people who chose darkness over death. You can visit. You can walk the tunnels where Byzantine Christians hid from Arab raiders. You can see the stone doors that sealed entire communities in protective darkness. You can peer down ventilation shafts extending to depths you cannot fathom, but you cannot experience what they experienced. You cannot feel the weight of months underground. You cannot know the particular terror of hearing enemies above while you huddle below in silence. You cannot understand the relief when the doors finally open and sunlight returns, or the grief of those who died in darkness and never saw the surface again. The city preserves the architecture, but the experience, the knowledge, the wisdom, born of desperate necessity, that died with the last generation to use Derinkuyu for its intended purpose. We inherit the monument. We have lost the meaning. And perhaps that is appropriate, because to truly understand Derinkuyu would require living through the conditions that created it. And that is an understanding no civilization should seek. Better to visit as tourists, to marvel at the engineering, to feel appropriate humility before human adaptability and resilience, and to hope, quietly, that we never need to remember how to survive as Derinkuyu's builders did. Because the city still waits. The ventilation shafts still reach to the surface. The stone doors, some still in place, could still be rolled closed. The chambers could still shelter 20,000 people if necessity arose. Derinkuyu is not merely historical, it is potential. A reminder that the infrastructure for survival exists beneath our feet, carved by ancestors who knew that civilization on the surface is temporary, but humanity's need to endure is permanent. The city that hid beneath the earth teaches a final uncomfortable truth. We are always one catastrophe away from needing it again.